Illinoisans may soon be able to keep their medical debt off their credit report. A bill in the state Senate would make it illegal for credit reporting agencies to use medical debt as a factor when determining someone's credit score. It would only apply to debt accrued in Illinois. The bill's sponsor argues medical debt is not an accurate predictor of whether someone will pay their bills and shouldn't be used against them.
This legislation, I want to stress, does not mean consumers don't have to pay that medical debt and their medical bills. I just believe medical debt is different than other debt. It's spontaneous. Credit scores, as we know, play a big role in consumers' lives, and it's important that they predict their credit worthiness as accurate as possible.
The bill does not prevent someone from having their wages garnished or assets seized due to unpaid medical debt.